Thank you. That was really a wonderful introduction. And I feel in some ways not just welcomed by that introduction, but that I actually don't have anything to do now. So it's great to be here. I looked at your website, some of the work you're doing, and you really are not just doing work that should inform Greenville, but really should inform the whole country. I'm going to share with you some thoughts and some challenges. And I think, they say you don't have to preach to the choir. And I always think if you get the choir together, you do have to make sure they can sing together. So I'm going to maybe do some singing later on. But also I want to even encourage you to raise the bar a little bit more, both because Greenville, what's happening in Greenville, what's happening in the country, and also what's happening in the world. So I have a PowerPoint, and if we can flip to it, I may not get through all of it, but I'll leave it with you, and hopefully as a resource. So part of the thing is that we're going through huge changes. This is a quote from Michael Porter. Many of you may know him. He's at Harvard. And he's written a lot about business and leadership. And what he says is that there's actually a change going on. He writes about this extensively. He basically says business is in a crisis. Capitalism is in a crisis. And that business needs to think about creating shared values. Creating shared values. And I really agree with that with one caveat. I think we collectively create shared values. So it's not business creating shared values and then taking them to society. It's business in concert with the rest of society needs to think about shared values. And when we think about those shared values, the question is, what are we trying to do? Why is that so important right now? And I would suggest to you that the problem of the 21st century is a problem of othering. Now, most of you haven't heard that word before because I made it up. But it's a good word. And, if you teach at a fancy university, you only get to keep your tenure if every 2 or 3 years you make up a new word. So othering is a process in which we actually fail to recognize our shared humanity, in which we recognize someone is different than us in some significant way. And when we talk about diversity, in some ways you could say it's the flip side of othering. Ms. Davis talked about diversity is not the same as inclusion. So we are diverse. That's just the reality. It doesn't mean we're inclusive. Inclusive actually is a process. It's what we do with diversity. If we don't do something inclusive with diversity, what we end up doing is have a diverse society where we are othering each other. Now, othering happens across many different axes. It's not just race, it's also gender, it's also age, it's also disability, sexual orientation, national origin. Any way that we say to people, you don't belong. You don't belong. And the judge spoke this morning about segregation in Brown v. Board. In some ways, that was an epitome of a society saying to black people, you do not belong. Not only do you not belong in our schools, you don't really belong in our country. We're kind of stuck with you, but you really don't belong. When we talk about building a wall, when we talk about saying to some people that if they speak with an accent, and again, as Ms. Davis exemplified this morning, we all have an accent. We all speak with an accent. And, excuse me. So the question of belonging is present on our mind. And these are 2 books that deal with this issue. One is by Samuel Huntington. Some of you may recognize his work. He did a book earlier called The Clash of Civilization. And his more recent book is Who Are We? The other book is by Jeff Chan, a friend of mine, and his book is called Who We Be. And it's sort of interesting as book ends, because Huntington is looking at an imagined past. And in that imagined past, he says, we shouldn't say we're a country of immigrants. We're a settler country. The country was settled by Anglos and Saxons. And if you're not an Anglo or Saxon, you're welcome here in this country if you behave, if you adhere to the norms and rules and patterns, customs of the Anglo-Saxons. And what were those rules and norms, Dr. Huntington? He doesn't leave us guessing. He tells us. He said they were English-speaking, They were not just Christians, they were Protestants. He goes on and describes in great detail. And he says, those of you who come afterwards, so if you're an Irish American, Italian American, German American, you came afterwards. You're welcome as long as you adhere to those rules. He skips over Native Americans. I don't know what he did with them. But that's his imagined past. His imagined past is that the country is a country where all the values and norms and customs were set by those people who came at the beginning. Jeff Chan actually looks at the country and he sees something different. And they're both writing in response to this exploding diversity that's happening in the country. And Jeff Chan says, who we be. And he's not talking about an imagined past. He's talking about an imagined future. A future where the country is deeply diverse and is welcoming and inclusive, and all people belong, where no one is othered. So that's his version. Now, we're not there. Right now, we're a country that's riddled with anxiety. And we can measure this, so this is not just analytics. We can empirically measure that the country is more anxious almost on a daily basis. And I started talking about this and trying to get academics and scholars to focus on the anxiety when Senator Obama was running for president. And I wrote an article saying if he wins, we're not going to be in a post-racial society. We run the risk of being deeply anxious in our society. And people said, no, you got it wrong. If he wins, we'll be done with race. We have a few things to clean up, but we'll be in a glorious time where race will all be behind us. Some of those people came back to me later and said, well, how did you know? So diversity, and Robert Putnam writes about this, diversity, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, if it's not handled right, creates great anxiety in society. And that anxiety, we're watching it morph into fear. Now, it doesn't just happen that people are angry and people are afraid, they are. But leaders matter. How people deal with anxiety, whether we actually embrace Huntington or Jeff Chan or something else, depends on leadership. And you are about leadership. And it's very important that you understand leadership in the way that Michael Porter suggests. As business leaders, you're not just thinking about dollars and cents. As he says, creating shared values, creating a society where we all possibly belong. We're not there. So McAdams and other social scientists have actually written and cataloged what's happening in America. And what they see is that the country is more divided today than any time since the Civil War. Now, I would venture to guess if that continues, that will not be a healthy business climate. It will not be a healthy political climate. It will not be a healthy social climate. And so part of what Porter and others are talking about is that business, he says, social responsibility is not enough in this climate. We got to go beyond that. And yes, we are diverse. That's not enough. We have to be inclusive. That's not enough. We have to actually have values that reflect a shared society. That's the challenge of the 21st century. And we see the growing inequality makes that harder. Now, there's a business case for making sure that equality doesn't get out of hand. A friend of mine is writing a book called Toxic Inequality. The International Monetary Fund has produced a paper showing that once inequality becomes exploded beyond a certain level, it undermines not just the social fabric, it undermines the economy itself. And I would say that's even more so when that divide is along important identity axes like race. So these are business questions as well as economic and social questions. Now, we have several ways in which we organize our identity. One of them is along the business axis, another is along the political axis, but a third is along what I call the ontological axis. Now, if you don't like the word ontological, you can just say spiritual, or how we make sense of who we are individually and collectively. So when Huntington and Chan are writing, they're talking about who we are collectively. And part of who we are oftentimes is defined on who we define as the other. Sometimes we define ourselves by those that are not like us. It's interesting, there's actually a exchange in California when California was trying to figure out how it's going to draw its segregation lines. And there's a conversation, a real conversation between an Anglo and a Latino. And they says, only whites can be citizens of California. That's the debate. And the Latino is saying, well, what does that mean? And the Anglo says, as long as you're not black, it's okay. So these questions are real. And what I want to suggest, as we go through these huge changes in terms of increased diversity, we're not just seeing a change in our economic system, a change in our political system, we're actually seeing a change in our identities themselves. And that's one of the reasons that this is potentially so scary and so hard. And leaders will, and already are, playing a major role. What does this mean? And I talk to my students about this often, and I say, I'm not really sure, but it means something. That I am sure of. And what it means is not something just to figure out, it's something to create. What it means depends on what you do, what I do. And one of the ways I sort of exemplify this with people, and I don't know if it'll work in this August group or not, but I'll try it. In the year 2010, 15% of the marriages in the United States was between people of different race or ethnicities, 15%. The projection is that in the next 10 to 20 years, that number will go from 15% to 25%. A quarter of Americans will be in what's called interrelationships in terms of marriages. 40% of families in 2010 had someone in their family of a different race or ethnicity. And in the next 10 to 20 years, that number will hit 60%. Something's happening in America. Now here's what I do with different groups, because that's an interesting data. Interracial, interethnic, marriage, or family. So I'm going to ask you, if that describes your family, raise your hand. And look around. And I can't see because the lights, but it looks like more than half the people. And here we are in Greenville, South Carolina. So something's happening in America. And as some people are afraid. At the height of the civil rights movement, I just came from Atlanta, Georgia, and went through many of the museums there. But at the height of the civil rights movement, segregationists were saying, we can't let black and white children go to school together. If they do, there'll be miscegenation. We don't use that word much anymore. Black children and white children will marry, and some of those married couples will have sex. And the civil rights movement's response was, no, you got it all wrong. This is not about relationships or marriage. This is about education. They're not going to be dating or marrying, so don't worry. And we still have problems with segregation in schools and in neighborhoods and even in the business world. But somehow people are finding each other despite that. So what I'm saying is that something's happening in the country that's quite profound. When we look at what it takes to actually have businesses be inclusive, we have to look at how businesses are financed. We have to look at capital, not just financial capital. We have to look at human capital and social capital. There have been a number of articles saying in terms of black and minority businesses, the number one crisis for them in terms of growing is lack of access to capital. But not just, again, just financial capital, but also human capital and social capital. Are they networked? Are they in relationship? Are they in the right relationship? And I could tell stories of working with some businesses, particularly black businesses, that couldn't grow because they couldn't get venture capital, particularly in Cleveland. And as soon as that changed, they started to grow. So to me, it's a great thing that you are working on these problems here in Greenville. And again, that's one of the reasons I think you are really a beacon for the whole country. Now, those of you who attended Ms. Davis' workshop heard a lot about the unconscious, and I have some of that in my slides. That's one of the things I teach at Berkeley. So I'm going to go over this quickly and skip some of it, but I want to just highlight a couple of things. The unconscious mind is fast, big, and disorderly. It doesn't respond to rational thought well. It doesn't respond to data. The conscious mind is small, very slow, and sort of literal. So you have these two different processes. We process about 11 million bits of information a second unconsciously, and only 40 bits of information a second consciously. Some colleagues argue that the conscious is a fraud. It doesn't even exist. It actually is just getting stuff from the unconscious and claiming it, think it thought it up, but it didn't. Now, oftentimes when I tell people this, they say, well, you know, I can believe that about my partner, that, you know, because they don't know what they're doing half the time. But I know what I'm doing. I'm consciously aware of what's going on in my life. The reality is we actually don't know what's going on. We have biases, we have stereotypes, we have anxiety, and a lot of it's behind our mind, a lot of it's automatic. And those biases, those stereotypes, those anxieties are not personal. We experience them in our body, not necessarily in our mind. Our bodies are better at reflecting the unconscious in our mind, our conscious mind. They're social. It's what we're getting from society. So the fact that we have these doesn't make us bad people. Once we're aware of them, though, we can do things to counteract them. So I'm going to just take you to a couple of quick exercises. This one, I want you to say out loud the colors on the screen as they appear. I want you to ignore the words. We're only interested in the colors. And I'm going to do it at a pretty good clip. You ready? All right. Ooh, that was weak. Does anybody have any coffee or? All right, let's do it a little bit more. I mean, is it what, 400 or 500 people in here? Okay, let's try again. Okay, that was better. And I don't know if how that felt for you, but how up here it sounded like when you got to line 2 and 3, you struggled a little bit. Is that how it felt to you? So let me suggest why you might have struggled, for those of you who did, is that when the words and the color are consonant, you can say them faster. When they're inconsistent, it slows you down. Because even though I asked you not to read, I have a suspicion that most of you were reading. The unconscious is unruly. So when you say to the unconscious, we don't want you to notice someone's gender, that's not polite. The unconscious says, you can do what you want to do. I'm noticing. In fact, we're going to have a meeting. And because the unconscious is fast, it does this before the conscious even comes online, which means the ability to consciously control these associations and these social biases is actually limited. We can't directly control them. There are other things we can do. How many of you see a shape up there? And what is the shape? Okay, great. Now, at this point, you realize that there was no triangle up there. You made it up. One of the things the unconscious does is it fills in the blanks. You see what you expect to see. If you look at the white is uniform throughout, and yet we make up seeing a triangle. And now we're going to take you to the movies and show you a brief video. There should be sound.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So, as I said, in fact, you did see the moonwalking bear. All of you saw it at unconscious level, but many of you didn't see it at a conscious level. The conscious only process about 40 bits of information a second, and which of those 40 you process is largely given to us. And there's things we can do called priming, which basically tells you to notice some things and not notice other things consciously. So, for example, we know, because of priming in our society and associations, that oftentimes in schools, the teacher will notice bad behavior in a black child and will not notice that same behavior in a white child. Not because the teacher is a racist, but because she or he has been primed to notice certain things and not notice other things. Now, what the unconscious is doing is filling in blanks, is seeing what was expected to see, and is creating what's called schemas or clumps of information. To help the conscious process some information, because you can't process 11 million bits of information a second. So I said to you that you saw the bear unconsciously. The interesting thing, you don't have to see things consciously in order for them to affect you. Even if things are exposed to us at a subliminal level, we still are affected by them. So I want you to look at this slide and tell me what you see. Did anyone, let's do it one more time. Did anyone see what that was? Okay, let's do it a little slower. Did anyone see it that time? What was it? Two faces was what? Can you say more about the faces? One's white and one black. So here's what we do with this experiment. We show people a degraded article, in this case, a gun, and after you've exposed people to the black face, their ability to identify the degraded object speeds up. Because in our society, we have an unconscious association between blacks and guns and blacks and violence, even though factually, whites are more likely to own guns than blacks. Facts don't matter to the unconscious. How the unconscious builds up these associations is frequency and proximity. Frequency and proximity. So Pavlov's dog. You ring a bell, you feed the dog. Ring a bell, feed the dog. Ring a bell, the dog starts salivating. There's no causal relationship between a bell and food. The dog is not rationally thinking. And so in a sense, and I'm not trying to call you a dog, I let other people do that, but all of us have a dog mind in a sense. The unconscious is just making associations. So on the media, television, radio, newspaper, stories, we create associations in our society, and we cannot measure those associations. We use about 11 million words as adults in our society, and we can measure the association between words and certain attributes. And it won't surprise you, there's a very powerful association in our society between blacks and negative outcomes, between Latinos and negative outcomes, that affects all of us. It affects all of us because it's the air we're breathing. But it affects people in the dominant group more than it affects people in the targeted group. So we have negative associations, for example, between women and math. It affects all of us, but it affects men even more. And so when we see a woman, where the unconscious is already thinking, I hope she's not bringing a math problem because she can't do it. So those kind of things affect our behavior and affect outcomes. And part of our job as leaders is to help people become aware of that and help people address that. Now, one reason I'm spending time on this is because in our society today, one of the ways we think we get beyond issues like race and gender discrimination is just not talk about it. It's like, well, if we could just not see it, if we could not talk about it. And what I'm trying to suggest is it's already in the environment. And not talking about it means the unconscious is running ripshod. So part of being a leader is to not only talk about it, but to talk about it in a way that allows people to actually stay in the conversation and be constructive. Because oftentimes when we talk about race, everybody's uncomfortable. Everybody's uncomfortable. People of color often mad, white people often embarrassed, and it's like, I'm not going back to that party. That was no fun. So when we look at what's going on in the country, a lot of things get associated. So race is actually quite important. And even when we don't talk about race directly, oftentimes we talk about it indirectly. We talk about welfare, we talk about food stamps, we talk about, one of my favorite is the inner city. I grew up in Detroit. When I grew up in Detroit, it was called Detroit. And you know, Detroit, like a lot of large Midwestern cities, became blacker. And when you become black past a certain point, you stop being the city, you become the inner city. And there's a negative association with the inner city. There's a story about a very nice white woman named Sue Smith, and they lived in the suburbs, and Sue Smith went to Detroit, and her family hadn't seen her for years, and someone was asking about her. I haven't seen Sue in 3 or 4 years. What happened to her? And her parents said, we don't know. She went to the inner city. You know, it's like she disappeared. So I live in San Francisco now. San Francisco, big city, it doesn't have an inner city. It's just a city. So these terms become associated with certain assumptions. I've already talked a little bit about the demographic changes. They're happening very fast. Let me just make one comment, though, and this is not to chide you, but we talk about minority. I live in California. Who's the minority in California? The largest single ethnic group in California are Latinos. They're still marginalized, but they're not minority. The term itself carries certain assumptions. So it doesn't mean because now the Latinos are the plurality, the largest group in California, it doesn't mean we have a Latino governor. It doesn't mean all the banks are run by Latinos. It doesn't mean Latinos live in Beverly Hills. So numbers by themselves don't capture this. But the term minority, and I've always thought about this when they say minority and women. It's like, why are you linking minority and women? Women are not, almost in any country, women are the majority. So what are we really doing? What are we really saying? Part of what we're saying is that there's a process of marginalizing people that actually affects women. Well, if that's what we're talking about, marginalization and a process of marginalization, we should actually talk about that. It's not explained by women's gender. It's explained by different processes of othering. And so you can be a majority and still be othered. Now, some of you may know that the United States is in an interesting debate right now. We're a country over 200 years old, and after 200 years, we're considering, in fact, I think we're more than considering, we've all but decided that it would be okay to have a woman on a dollar bill or maybe a $20 bill. Now think about that. It took 200 years for us to decide it's okay to have a woman on our currency. And that's controversial in 2016. Some people are saying, no, you can't do that. Particularly interesting, they're talking about a woman associated with slavery, or at least anti-slavery, Harriet Tubman. And they're talking about not removing, but asking Andrew Jackson if he'd move down the street. Put him on the back of the bill. That's what they're talking about. And you know, Andrew Jackson did some interesting things. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. These processes, in terms of noticing people, happen really fast. And this is not meant to be a plug. I do a lot of consulting for a fruit company in California called Apple, and you may recognize this as the Apple Watch. I'm not getting paid to say that. But very quickly, we recognize gender and race. We actually recognize race as unconscious level even before we recognize gender, before the conscious comes online. So the challenge for leaders is how do you begin to deal with this? And you need different kind of leadership for different kinds of issues. I want to suggest two kinds of leadership that's quite important in terms of the work you're doing right now. So one is called bonding, and one's called bridging. Bonding is basically where you're taking people of the same value, fairly homogeneous, and organizing them in some way to engage in some sort of collective action. Bridging is when you're working across groups, or the groups are heterogeneous. So I want to suggest that both are necessary, and it's very important to be deliberate, especially about bridging. How do you bridge leadership across different racial, ethnic, gender, religious groups? And that's something that will happen much more likely at the leadership level than at the day-to-day level. And even the name ACE actually begins to speak into that. I'm going to skip over the next couple of things because we're running short on time, and a lot of these things you're already doing. But one of the things I do want to bring your attention to is what I call opportunity structures. So a lot of times when we deal with issues of race, when we deal with issues of othering, we think it's mainly a psychological process. If I can only like my neighbor, if I eat some barbecue or tacos, I'm being diverse. And I don't have anything against barbecue and tacos, although I'm vegetarian. But barbecue tofu is really good. But that's not enough. You actually have to look at structures, look at how we organize space, look at how we organize money, and we can map this out. We actually call it opportunity structures. And when you map out structures, we use about 32 or 34 different indicators. Some people use as many as 100. Again, Michael Porter talks about cluster mapping, so you can map out where businesses are, where money is, how it's flowing, and then overlay on top of that the populations that are underserved and see what's happening. And you see oftentimes they don't have access to those resources. And so you can like them. If you don't put them in relationship to those things to enhance their outcome in business, you like them, but they're never going to actually succeed. So one of the things is to be conscious of structures and define opportunity and structures in the way that works for you, but then also make sure that the structures are not marginalizing people along racial lines. We can actually map out where black people live, what access they have, the opportunities, and then see if in fact they actually can succeed. And if people are isolated from structures, they're not going to, as a group, succeed. You'll always get a few people who are outliers, people like the judge, whose home and whose conditions were not favorable, as he described this morning, but he succeeded anyway. But that's not true for most of us. We can also look at in terms of what's happening in large society, and I've already talked a little bit about toxic inequality. So I want to end by talking about how we can practice belonging in our everyday lives. But I'll start with a quote from one of my favorite authors who was othered in multiple ways, James Baldwin. And he says, "We're all androgynous, not only because we are born of a woman and impregnated by the seed of a man, but because each of us, helplessly and forever, contain the other, male and female, female and male, white and black, black and white. We are part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair, and so very often do I, but none of us can do anything about it." So what Baldwin is saying, and I agree with this, is actually, in strong terms, there is no other. We are deeply a part of each other. King talked about a beloved community. We're connected to each other, but how do we actually begin to celebrate that? And so there are things we can do. Part of it is representation, making sure there's some people not just in the audience, but in the boardroom, making sure there's some people in the movies. It's not simply removing structural barriers. It's to organize structures to produce the outcomes you want. I call it structural inclusion. How do we actually organize structures so they're doing the work that we want? And from a lot of research, this also makes good business sense. The companies that are more diverse actually, on average, are more productive. Now, we're not saying there's a causal relationship, but there definitely is a relationship. Determine how you're going to intervene, where you're going to intervene. Recognize that people are situated differently, not necessarily because people are fundamentally different. I don't think people are. But people are situated different within structures. So when we build an escalator to get us to the third floor, someone comes along in a wheelchair, they cannot use that escalator. Or if they use it, they'll be clumsy. So recognizing that people are situated differently, that races are situated differently, that women and men are situated differently in our society, suggests the kind of interventions that we might make. And I advocate something I call targeted universalism. In our effort to be fair and inclusive, sometimes we say, treat everybody the same. And I say, no, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to treat everyone fairly. We have universal goals, and we have targeted strategies based on how we're situated. The strategy for getting someone to the third floor in a wheelchair is different than the strategy for someone who can step on the escalator. And I often tell the story about going to The Ohio State University. And the rule there, the universal rule, was that if you're doing something on company business and you need to get a car, even if you're going to pay for it out of your own pocket, you have to get a subcompact. And I'm almost 6'4". When I was younger, I was 6'4". One of the things that happens when you get old, you not only get gray hair, you get shorter. But anyway, and I said, I'm not doing that. And the person who was head of the vice provost of all things important said, yes, you are. That's the rule. Everybody is the same. We treat everybody the same. And I said, look, the person who developed that rule, I bet you a dime to a donut, was under 6 feet. And that issue went all the way up to the chancellor. And the chancellor didn't change the rule. Instead, what he did is say, okay, John, I'm going to give you the right to ride around in a big car. And so when I would drive around in a big car and people, in fact, on the campus would see me, they go, ooh, there goes Professor Powell in this big car. He thinks he's all that in a box of chips. And all I was trying to do was be comfortable. So recognizing that people are situated differently is important, and it's important not just to sort of quote unquote fix the person, but think of the structure itself. We all need to belong, we all need to belong in what I call the circle of human concern. And leadership is quite important in terms of addressing that. Last thing I want to say is that there are different types of leadership. There's leadership that is critical when things are well structured and we have transactions and we want to sort of make those transactions go smoothly. There's a different kind of leadership when things are being transformed. And what I'm suggesting to you right now is the country, the world, Greenville is actually going through tremendous transformation. And we need leadership to sort of bridge us, not only with each other, but to bridge us to the future. And the future that I want is the one that Jeff Chan talks about, not the one that Sampson Huntington Ward talks about. So thank you. And I think there's time for some questions. I think there are mics on either side. So if you have a question, if you can go to the mic and we'll proceed. I can't see it. I see people walking around. I don't know if they're going to the mics or not. Okay, if there are no questions, oh yeah, that's a question. If you didn't have any questions, I had a question, which is, why don't you have any questions?
Well, I assume that everyone's probably really full and enjoyed their meal, so I'll kick us off. Maybe there'll be a couple of questions. My name's Harold. Thank you so much for your time. One of the things that I struggle with as a new leader in this community is understanding the concept of how diversity actually works in business, specifically when you look at most people in positions of power don't necessarily look like me, but at the same time may put that, oh, you're Harold, you're not like A, B, C, these other people who look like me. So how do you think about how we as leaders in different spaces are able to address the need or the demand for, people want diversity, but diversity like themselves. I want to hire someone who may be white, but who's white like Harold, or Asian, but Asian like Harold. How do you suggest that we take away from that and try and work through that?
Well,
Thank you.
It's a great question. You know, networks matter a lot. One of the things I have people do sometime is, and I think I have you do it right now. So we'll start by just saying, if you have glasses, take them off. And then what I'm gonna have you do is cover one eye and look straight ahead, and then take your hand, go back and forth like this. Okay, and you can do this more at home. So could you see your hand throughout the movement? In other words, as you're moving back and forth, can you see your hand consistently? Okay, some people say no, most people say yes. Okay. The reason I have you do that is because most people will see their hands consistently. You have a blind spot. We all have a blind spot in each of our eyes where our nerves come together at the back of our eye. But we don't see it. We don't see a hold in our vision, even when we look out with one eye. And the reason is your unconscious fills it in. So you think, I see things perfectly. You go to the eye doctor and they play with that little dot and it disappears. Where did it disappear to? It went in what's called the blind spot. So one of the things in terms of your question is that one of the strengths of diversity when done well is that we have different blind spots. So the things I won't see that you will. The things that you don't see that I will. So part of the things as leaders is to help people understand that diversity is not just getting people who look different than me, but behave exactly as me. If they have exactly the same blind spot as me, but they have more hair, they're shorter, maybe a lighter skin, I didn't really accomplish very much. Part of the thing is that we actually want to actually have diversity, both for the process of being inclusive, but also we actually make better decisions. We have exposure to different markets. We can sort of see and anticipate things that we wouldn't otherwise. We get critical questions that we would never get. So and this is part of the challenge. When we bring in people, and part of the thing for what you were suggesting is we don't want to bring in one person. We don't want to bring in one woman in a boardroom with 50 men. We actually want what's called critical mass. We want enough women so that the women can have an effective voice as women and recognize that each woman is different. So we need critical mass. How do we actually begin to sort of identify critical mass? And when you do that, the interesting thing that occurs, not only do you get different decisions, you start to affect the structure itself. You start to actually see things you didn't otherwise see. You start to notice things you wouldn't otherwise notice. So that's what we're trying to get to. It's not, we don't want a token, and we don't want a replica of exactly who we are, though it's different hues. We actually want real diversity to reflect what's happening in the country and the world. Any other questions? Thank you.